Most of you are familiar with me. You might have been on one of my other talks, so I'm not going to dwell on myself. Basically, a long time aficionado, I guess, of SharePoint. Spent maybe a dozen years or so focusing on this platform. I have a background in law, which brought me into the content management space. But I'm a developer at heart and really focused on the developer community, trying my best to bring best practices, push the envelope, whatever you want to think about, right, in terms of development and what we need, the tools that we need in order to provide solutions. I do maintain a blog, although I haven't been very active lately. Been doing a lot of research into content lifecycle management methodology, which I'll now begin sharing on my blog. And there'll be links and contact information at the end. So the agenda that I've laid out, just in keeping with this basic theme of content lifecycle management, what are the real questions that we have in terms of where we are, where we're going, and what's provided by this new cloud-based initiative? But we really do need to focus on what are the challenges that are inherent in managing a full content lifecycle, whether in the cloud or on-premise. So I'm going to deal with that a little bit. And then focus in on some of the specific tools that both platforms provide. And I'm going to have to talk about Exchange, okay? Because when we're talking about content lifecycle management, we really have to talk about email. And often the conversation is skewed because we're focusing on an architecture for supporting content lifecycle management that was really derived from an on-premise model that we've inherited and sort of been carrying along. Exchange introduces a number of key concepts that will find their way into the way we approach content lifecycle management, or CLM, in SharePoint as well as SharePoint Online. And then end with some sort of general strategies for dealing with email and documents in this context, okay? So what are we dealing with? We're talking about the cloud. One way of thinking about it that I find useful is to think about it as an emerging utility, an information utility, right? A cloud-based network of services, not unlike electricity, right? Where we are taking advantage of economies of scale to reduce the costs, the barriers of entry into being able to support the kind of workflows that users are moving towards in their private lives as well as their professional lives, right? You've probably heard this message repeatedly, that whether you put processes in place for users to take advantage of within your organization or not, these pressures are still going to be there, and users are going to find a way around your controls one way or the other, right? So to embrace this notion of the cloud providing some of these core services, what are some of the services that they're going to have to provide in order to support full content lifecycle management? Okay? So to get a peek into this emerging infrastructure, right? What are some of the key components of these different architectures? What are you getting, right, from SharePoint Online that you're not getting on-prem? So looking at it from this utility perspective, you're getting a lot of simplification, right? We all know, if we've dealt with records management in the SharePoint on-prem environment, there's a lot of bells and whistles. There's a lot of levers that you have to pull. There's a lot of configuration. It's painful. You have to actually work at it, right? And IT is involved. IT often not well-versed in a lot of the structures that we need as information managers, et cetera, okay? You're getting integrated security. One thing that you're getting here that's interesting is that you have now the possibility of unified EDiscovery across SharePoint and Exchange from within SharePoint, right? Okay, which you don't, you may not think that you need that, but when we talk about email, right, and the fact that a lot of protected content is flowing through the email, this actually makes a lot of sense, particularly at the point of compliance when you're asked to provide evidence of interactions, transactions, and things like that. EDiscovery becomes, unified EDiscovery becomes important. There are limitations with all of these benefits. I'll put benefits in quotes, right? Because they all come with caveats. And then obviously multi-device support that you're getting through the online provision of services. Things that you get on-prem that you don't get online: support for custom service applications, and I don't know how many are hardcore developers, right, who've had to build these kinds of customizations, right? Okay, well, that's a big issue, right? The ability to plug in your own custom application, service application, is a big, big plus for dealing with the gaps that exist between what you need in terms of the services that are provided out of the box and the actual services that you need. You obviously have more third-party solutions. There are a lot of apps being created. Billions of apps that were downloaded just last year, right? So apps are happening all over the place, but not in this environment, right? So the uptake for third-party solutions in this environment is much, much slower than it has been here. We've got some well-defined, well-developed, well-architected third-party solutions available that extend the platform, that the online architecture has slowed. Okay, so it's been more of a burden for those third-party vendors to provide similar solutions for the cloud. So we have to wait. This one I stuck in there because I was quite fond of the ability to separate the notion of record declaration from actual records management. And even though people were clamoring for the in-place preservation notion, there were mechanisms that I, as a developer, could take advantage of in order to create a hybrid solution, to put my own interpretation of what record declaration means. In this environment, I don't have that ability anymore. I have to go with Microsoft's definition of what record declaration means, which is a limiting factor. Data migration, simpler, a lot more third-party support, right, than what you have here. The data migration here, you're dealing with not just the migration, but the migration into the cloud, so there are other issues to be considered, right? These are just a few of the key, these are the key differences and distinctions with regard to CLM. There are obviously other differences between them, okay? I decided to present this idea just to get a sense for what we're talking about. When we talk about content lifecycle management, I'll go into a little bit more detail later. You can basically break it up into these basic stages. There's some, once you get into this area, it's more of an iterative process, so you could consider that management plus publication of content. But this is the basic flow. You're capturing information, storing it, publishing it, making it available for collaboration, workflow, et cetera, and then finally applying some rules to deal with compliance. You're doing this preservation stage. But I decided to lay this out to get a sense for, because there's a lot of resistance, okay, in the marketplace to moving into the cloud for obvious reasons, right? But where's that really coming from, and more precisely, when is it coming, right? When is that resistance coming? So if you look at risk versus benefit, right, I called it value in another version of this slide, but then that gets into connotations that I want to avoid. Basically, if you're looking at the benefits, right, the benefits start to increase as you get more into the collaborative area, right? This is where the real, carrot is for an organization. You want to be able to provide that highly dynamic, collaborative environment where people can easily share information. Your business processes are there. EDiscovery is a big deal, right? And so that's going to have a lot of hits, right? But then as you get off into, the preservation stage, the benefit starts to decline. As we have long-term preservation of records, we don't really care that much about it, except that it's preserved. But if you look at risk, right, it's kind of flipped. right? Risk is really high for misclassification. So you have to really pay attention to how incoming content is being classified, right? And then suddenly, once it's classified, the risk drops dramatically because you've put it in a place or you've tagged it in such a way that it can support your compliance initiatives that'll come later, right? And then gradually your risk starts to increase because EDiscovery then brings in more risk that you're going to not find the things that you need. Collaboration introduces more risks because you might have to take things out and move them around, change the rules and things like that. Gradually risk increases. And then you get a different kind of risk toward the end because you might just keep things too long, okay? And you got to really manage retention. You've got to think about how long stuff stays there. So if you look at it from that perspective, you've kind of got this flip going on. But if you then lay on top of that, well, you know, capture is going to be more of an on-premise activity, mostly, right? Because you're bringing content in and you're going to need to provide the kind, let's say migration, right? The migration tools for the cloud are really not as strong as they are for on-prem. You've got more options for bringing content in on-prem. You're probably going to have a mixture of, you know, some sort of on-prem classification, capture mechanism, maybe even tied to your physical records coming in. You're putting them on a scanner and they're coming in, right? You're then moving it into the cloud to take advantage of all this stuff, right, where your benefits are, and then you're moving it on-prem again, right? You're not going to, you know, I was talking to someone yesterday and said, well, you know, would you invest in a public company that took all of its records and gave it to a third party and just said, okay, you take care of it, right? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, but you're doing that already. You've got, what, Iron Mountain, they do that for you, right? But, you know, imagine the first day that Iron Mountain opened its doors for business, okay? You know, were there a lot of people rushing to give them all their records? Probably not, right? So we're in a transition. We're moving toward a level where people will trust more a cloud-based or off-site storage, but that we're not there yet, particularly for electronic records, right? So you are talking about on-prem for long-term storage. And so if you look at it from that perspective, what do you see, right? Risk is higher on-prem than it is in the cloud. Value is higher in the cloud than it is on-prem, right? It kind of flips your intuitive thoughts, right? Okay? So there is, you know, justification for the cloud just based on the way that this kind of flows out. And if you think about it from that perspective, then you have to focus in on, okay, what are the reasons for not moving there? What are the reasons, aside from the obvious resistance, right? What are the underlying reasons for not taking your records into the cloud? Okay? Okay so far? All right. So we have to look at some of these architectural differences in more detail. Okay? What have you got architecturally from a developer's perspective on-prem? You've got a server object model that runs in full trust. Wide open in terms of what you can do with what SharePoint provides, right? We'll talk a little bit more about the gaps as we go further along. You've got custom event receivers, right? So you can imagine that you've got options there for dealing with certain kinds of events, like when an item is checked in, when it's checked out, right? To take special action to implement rules that SharePoint doesn't provide a declarative solution for, at least not yet, right? It can't, you know, there are custom scenarios, you know, as you get closer to a business-driven or domain-driven type of workflow, you're going to have custom scenarios that no vendor is going to be able to anticipate. So you need the ability to be able to hook in your custom logic, right? The way that you're doing that in the cloud is through workflow, right? You build a workflow, you hook it up, and then you provide some sort of custom logic. But we're really not there in terms of the developer mindshare to be able to create these workflows in such a way that it makes sense for a particular business. They're all custom, meaning you're using concepts that are very generic, right? What we need are building blocks that are not so generic, that are more specific to our business model, right? But they just don't exist yet, right? Maybe ultimately they will, right? If some vendor decides that it's worthwhile building them for your particular business. A lot of businesses that won't fall into that category, however. So in that same vein, on-prem, you have this notion of a record declaration hook that I was talking about before, the ability to be notified in code when someone says, I want to, declare this as a record in place manually. Can't anticipate what my interpretation of declaration means, so I need the ability to hook into that. And then custom routing, right? You've declared the record. Now you want to manage the record, which means that you've got to put it somewhere, preferably somewhere that has rules already baked into it that tell what happens, how long it should be kept, what should be done when it's disposed of. Again, can't anticipate all the different scenarios, so you need the ability to apply custom routing rules, okay? And you get all that on-prem, right? And of course, you get service applications, which means that you can have your own custom databases to manage rules. You can have custom metadata management. You can hook in various ways. And these are the ways that most of the third-party vendors have extended SharePoint in order to support CLM, okay? That's the prescribed way. In fact, it was sort of drilled into our heads that this is the way that you do this, okay? Office 365, not such a long list, okay? You've got the client object model, which is really that boundary between the on-prem cloud environment, and you've got a new model, this tenancy model, which constrains access to the actual resources that are being provided. No full trust code, no custom event receivers except for callbacks into your hosted application if you want, no record declaration hooks, very limited custom routing except for that declarative model, no service applications, okay? So maybe this doesn't make a lot of difference for us as developers, but it does make a difference for the third-party vendors that would provide us with the tools that we need, okay? And that has slowed adoption of records management in the cloud because the vendors just have not kept up, right? And there's an incentive, but there's a bigger incentive when you've invested a lot of money already in an on-prem product offering, okay? So, don't expect that they're going to be rushing to fill that gap very quickly. Some are, and I'll point out some of the ones who are. And there are a couple of companies that are really taking the lead in that, and I think that they're going to get a lot of positive votes in terms of dollars from the market because of that. Okay. So, what are some of the sort of inherent challenges in doing CLM? It's not just a cloud issue, okay? If you were doing CLM and you weren't using computers at all, it was all on paper, right? And you had a room set up with different partitions, right, for the different stages in CLM, it would still be a challenge, okay? Because people are involved in this, and classification is a requirement and classification is a problem. So, my caution is don't go too far in the direction of saying, well, SharePoint doesn't do this, doesn't do that, because there is an inherent people problem that we should embrace and figure out how to deal with within our organizations that is separate from whatever technology we choose. So I wanted to look at CLM for a minute. I won't dwell on it, but what are the inherent aspects of managing a content lifecycle, right? And dealing with the people problem. We have a legacy of bad habits that have come about because the tools have been inadequate, right? People are using, and we're very inventive as humans, right? So we will come up with a way to do what we need to do, okay? So if you tell me that, I've got to sit in a room and process incoming emails, okay? And when an email comes in from XYZ, right? In that case, I'm supposed to go through the email, make sure it has certain content in it. If it doesn't have that content in it, then I'm supposed to send it to Joe. But if it does have that content in it, then I have to send it to legal, right? Where are the rules? They're in my head, and I have to learn them, and that's just how I've been doing it for the last 15 years, okay? And everyone who told me to do it that way have left, right? And, I'm the senior person in the incoming mailroom or whatever. And, you know, if you want to work here, you've got to learn my way of doing things, because that's what Joe expects, and that's what legal expects, because they have also learned my bad habits, right? And because I didn't have a workflow tool, or because I didn't have a centralized place to put all the information that legal needs, I typically attach it to my email and I give it a certain kind of name, right? And if it doesn't have that name, if it doesn't have that right number, legal's not going to know what to do with it. They're going to send it back, right? So all of these rules now have to be somehow codified, okay? And IT comes along, codifies the rules, but they didn't tell me. They didn't consult with me. They just told me I have to now do it a different way. So, I mean, you can see the people problem just gets magnified, right? So we need to have a better way to interact with our existing rule bases, which are in the heads of people, and convert them into codified rules that we can work with, okay? The other thing is that people don't agree, you know, in terms of how to call things, even if they're the same thing, right? Just out of spite, you know, it's my way of doing it. So, getting consistent naming, consistent classification is hard. It requires retraining. Big issue here is you can't trust them to do things the same way all the time. They resist change. And this one I stuck in there because it's true. People do engage in risky behavior. You know, they're able to live with a certain level of risk, right? You know, they may appreciate the value or the risk to the organization of including the wrong information in an email when they send it along. They may not appreciate the value or the risk, but even if they do appreciate it, they may do it anyway, just because it's easier to do, okay? So we have to embrace this people problem before we start thinking about the technology that we're going to use to implement some of these rules. So to give sort of a right brain view of this, right? So we have these four basic stages: capture, store, publish, and preserve, right? And you can see that there's certain activities and certain services that go along with those stages, right? So whether human or application created, machine created, right? The information has to come in, it has to be stored. That brings into account some search and version control, check-in, check-out, auditing, it's all those things involved in storage. You know, you can have some search going on here too, right? But you get the basic idea. And you're dealing with retention rules, information policy, and those types of things over in the preservation layer. So let's talk a minute about what are the economies of scale that we get from the cloud, right? This global information sharing notion wasn't captured before, but here, that's really the main value that people perceive of being in the cloud. Information efficiency, by virtue of the fact that it's centralized. You're getting sort of a side effect benefit there. But this notion of elastic, scalable, shared services, you know, that is the ultimate sort of replacement for these siloed shared services that we have now as service applications, right? But the onus is on the utility provider to provide these shared services, right? Most of the, you know, cloud providers, you know, I mean, including others in addition to Office 365, it's too early for them to have really to think about what's the market justification for adding all the shared services that we need as records managers. So they're just not there yet, right? We can assume that they're going to get there, but they're just not there yet. They're focused on core business functions, right, at this point in time, okay? There are cloud risks that are also mitigated by these economies of scale, you know, the basic risks here. For example, you know, like to go from 99.99% uptime to 99.999% uptime is an order of magnitude, right? The cost goes way up, right, in order to provide that. Microsoft can do it, but most organizations can't do it on their own. So there are all these, you know, dynamics in terms of the value proposition for going into the cloud, right, that you probably heard many, many times before. Let's focus it in now on sort of the resistance points that exist in SharePoint, not SharePoint Online, in SharePoint for doing content lifecycle management in SharePoint. I'm talking about SharePoint On-Prem, okay? There are gaps in SharePoint On-Prem for doing not just records management, but content lifecycle management. So I'm going to go through these in some detail, right? Very limited support for physical records management. The content capture creation story is not ideal. There are issues for content storage, disposition, and management, meaning the day-to-day management of records that are being, that have been identified as records. I'm going to go into some detail now. So the physical records gaps. And you're going to see a repeating pattern as I go through these, right? It'll be obvious. Manual configuration for physical records, no real guidance provided for how you do that. Right? There are a lot of different ways to achieve mapping between physical storage and electronic storage. The basic idea is that you create a list, and the list somehow has metadata that has an ID, and that ID somehow gets translated into a printed label or a barcode that then gets affixed to a box or to a document, and then it goes off to some archival storage location. That's the general idea. But the mechanism for doing that is pretty involved, right? First of all, you have to have an ID, and that ID needs to be globally unique. Okay? Well, out of the box, there are limitations for globally unique identifiers. It's only for documents. It's not for list items. So you have to have some custom extension that will allow you to associate a GUID with a list item, right? There's a big oversight, right? So no support for bulk printing. It's a one-off printing. It's like an afterthought, right? But in the real world, you need to print IDs and labels and barcodes for hundreds, thousands of items that are going to go into a box, okay? That's not there out of the box, so you have to build that. You can't even print an index sheet with all the IDs on them, right? It's not built in. You have to craft that yourself. It's possible to craft it, but it takes some time and effort. And there's no consistency in how people do it. Content creation. Big problem is that you're not using rules to define your classification. Right? You're using physical structure, container structure, in order to define your classification, right? And permissions are also defined by location, right? Not by metadata. For example, if you assign permissions to an item, basically because of limitations of the way it's being stored, the item inherits its permissions from its location. So if you move it, the permissions don't go with it, right? But for content lifecycle management, the permissions have to follow the item as it goes through, which means that you need a separate database to manage the permissions, because the built-in storage mechanisms don't have the capacity to uniquely identify that many items, right? So you need to rely on a third-party solution which needs to have a custom database, which needs to have a service application in order to do that, okay? They exist, but it's a third-party solution, but it's dependent on the architecture of the on-prem product. Location-based declaration, right? You have basically in the SharePoint environment implicit and explicit declaration of records. I like those terms better than in-place records management. In-place records management doesn't mean anything, right? It's an explicit record declaration that you're doing, right? The implicit record declaration happens when you move it into a place that has rules associated with it or a policy associated with it, right? You're not explicitly declaring it a record, but because it's living in that particular location, it inherits certain characteristics and behaviors, and it's implicitly declared as a record, right? Well, there are other things that go on when you do the in-place explicit record declaration I'll talk about in a minute. Routing. You have to manually configure routing, right? It's not automatically provided for you, which means that you have to go through all the detailed steps of identifying the content type, selecting the content type, creating the content type, defining the metadata on the content type, associating the rules with the content type, And you have to do that repeatedly. Whenever you do a different site, you have to do that again and again and again and again. So that leads you back to IT, which will say, could you just give me a script that does this, right? But they don't know the rules that you know, so you have to work with it. So you can see that that's a gap, right? And no auto-population of metadata, no facility built in that will look at the document and figure out that, well, this is obviously an accounting document, so let's populate with some metadata. There's nothing available to do that inside the product. There are third-party solutions, but again, those third-party solutions require service applications in order to do that. All right, so I won't belabor that point. You get it, right? So you're seeing this phrase over and over again, manual configuration, right? That's really the heart of most of the gaps. You know, the platform provides these core fundamental services, but it relies on the IT staff or someone working closely with them to do the configuration, which is generally outside their comfort zone. Okay, so for storage, manual configuration, even of InPlace declaration, you have to specify when the user will be able to use InPlace record declaration. Another aspect of this InPlace declaration idea is that basically what it does is there's a ribbon command that says, I want to declare the record, and then it does something to the record individually. What does it do? It marks it as a record permanently, right? So this notion of content lifecycle management is a document that moves from one stage in its lifecycle to the next, which requires a different record classification because you've tightly bound classification and declaration. It's permanently marked as a record. It's difficult to distinguish documents as they're moving along by virtue of the fact that they've been declared. You have to overlay that with some other classification, another metadata field that allows you to manage it through its life. Manual configuration of the repository. As I mentioned before, you have to set up the content types, you have to specify the metadata, a lot of steps to do that, and you have to do it over and over again. Time-based retention is the only thing that's provided, no event-based retention, so no free-form interpretation of events like when the employee was terminated, right? That's the classic gap, but there are all these other gaps too. Even retention stages, even though they're there, you still have to manually declare them. For holds, you have to manually create them in each site collection, and no out-of-the-box support for supersession, right? So you're seeing this repeated theme, manual configuration, manual configuration. Who's going to do that configuration, right? You plus IT, right? IT only. And then finally, disposition. No support for bulk disposition, no ability for permanent records, right? No freeze idea. And no support, built-in support for records transfer, like to the National Archives or something like that, which happens all the time. Site deletion wasn't there at all until 2013, right? But now you have this notion of a site policy, which gives you options for when and how to delete a site, which is very useful, but it's not on by default, okay? So when you create a site, let's say you enable self-service site creation, and the users forget to turn on the site policy, well, users can go in and delete the site even if it has records in it, okay? You put a site policy in there that prevents deletion if records are in there, and that's what you want, but you got to turn it on, right? So there's just a lot of oversights there. And then finally, sort of from the management's perspective, there's really no concept of a file plan at all. And that's there in SharePoint 2013, right? There's no real concept of a file plan except what you can infer from the way that the document libraries are organized, okay? And you can get a report of how they're organized. You can get a report of what's going on inside there, but it's not really a file plan, and it's not centralized. It's specific to each site collection. Permissions, right, have to be set manually at all these different levels. And auditing is there, but really not the kind of auditing that we want. We want to know when a records manager has changed the classification of a document type, right? We want to know when users have interacted with the content based on a more robust set of rules. And similarly, we want much more robust support for reporting. Okay, so these are some of the gaps. This is kind of where we are in the SharePoint world in dealing with CLM. And third parties have risen to the challenge, right? One product, there are two products that I highly recommend. One is called Concept Searching, right, which gives you an auto tagging capability for looking at the document content coming in and presenting pretty good suggestions for which metadata fields should be associated with that document, which helps users get over that classification hurdle. Another one is called Collabware. They have a product called CLM, which embraces these gaps and provides solutions pretty much for each one of them, centralizing the file plan, creating a first-class file plan built into SharePoint. Very, very smartly done and worth a look, collabware.com. I highly recommend. So now what's next? What's the hardest problem that we have to deal with for content lifecycle management, right? It may not be obvious just looking at this, but it's email, okay? It's a veritable tsunami of content that's coming our way, okay? Right? 1 billion business email mailboxes last year, growing at about 10% per year, right? The volume of emails is just increasing radically, right? Records management idea, you know, you're going to siphon off some of the most important ones. You're going to have, you know, some antivirus and security, but basically, you got to find a way to deal with email. You got to find a place to put the emails. You got to find a place to put them in a compliant fashion, okay? Much bigger challenge in dealing with documents, even though the patterns are similar, okay? The other thing that's interesting is that email has always been a cloud service. It's always been client server, right? People are used to the constraints that email imposes, okay? Every email message that you see is generally a copy of an email message that's living in Exchange somewhere or some email server, right? So people are used to this notion of subscribing to a service that's providing them an interactive relationship with their content. And so, in my view, if we look at how Microsoft has dealt with Exchange Online, we can get some valuable insights for where they may be going with regard to document management in the cloud, right? Because those same constraints are now being imposed on documents, right? And even more so because people don't collaborate generally on email, right? But they do collaborate on documents, create documents together, and that move toward the cloud is going to give us that capability, but it also comes with the same similar constraints that we face in dealing with email. So what does CLM look like in Exchange? Well, there are these new ideas, right? And retention policies and tags, right? The retention schedule is kind of the collection of these things. You've got legal holds, and you've got in-place holds, right? Which are different, okay? This is a litigation hold, that's an in-place hold. You've got auditing and monitoring there. You know, you've got to deal with migration, and so there are different kinds of migration strategies that you might pursue when trying to move into an Exchange Online. But here we're also talking about migrating existing emails, let's say, into SharePoint. You know, you've got things that happened before, and now you've got to create a new environment. There are third-party archival solutions, like there are third-party CLM solutions for SharePoint that fill in some of the gaps that exist, okay? What does retention look like in Exchange? It's basically the tagging idea versus the drag and drop idea, right? But we saw Exchange actually move. So we used to have these things called managed mailboxes or managed folders, where the idea was that some, you know, information architect could set up your folders for you in a static way, very hierarchical, taxonomical, right? And that would be enough, that users would know where to put stuff, right? The email comes in and they move it over there into the right place. Well, it turns out that that raised the anxiety level of users to the point where they stopped doing it, right? They just stopped doing it. Or regardless of the taxonomy, they just put it in the first one there. That's just a user behavior that emerged after managed folders were provided. Managed folders providing that same kind of location-based rule, right, that we see in SharePoint, right? The idea was that you put the rule on the folder, you expose the folder to the users, and that tells them what to do. Well, users didn't like that so much. Tagging is much easier for users, right? So first of all, you can attach multiple tags to an item, right, which is more in line with the way that they're thinking about their information. They think about it differently when they're doing different things. And more on that in a second, because it actually raises there are a lot of rules for how you should tag email. So it's not as simple as this. I mean, you provide these capabilities, but there are times when you need to create default policies. If you don't create the default policy properly, then users may not apply the appropriate tag. It falls back to a default policy that doesn't fit with your compliance requirements. And so you've got to think about how these are set up. But the basic idea here is you got three types of tags. One is the fallback tag for when an item has not been tagged. Okay, so what do you do in that case? So you can associate the default policy tags with the folder, right? So that Exchange knows what to do with an untagged item. You got the retention policy tags, right? But then you've got to apply them to a folder because those are the actual workhorses. But then you've got this notion of a user-defined personal tag, but that's only available if you've got the enterprise license, right? It depends. It's a premium feature, right? So there's all these things that are tied into this, okay? So, there's a big table, you can download it from the internet. There's just a lot of different rules and overlaps of rules that we won't go into the details here, but you really have to pay attention to what those rules are because there's sort of rules of engagement, okay? A retention policy is nothing more than a group of tags so that it allows you to name it and attach it to a mailbox so that Exchange knows what to do. Still, very good idea because it fits more with users. Users are going to do this. Right? They're going to tag their items, right? You can even have aggressive policies that says if you don't tag them, you're going to lose them, okay? And users will say, okay, I'll tag them, right? They'll do that. Knowing which tags to provide is up to, your compliance team. Provide them with these tags so they'll know what tags they're available. And they will use them more readily, okay? EDiscovery. By far, most of the attention for, even in SharePoint 2013, we went from 2010 to 2013, most of Microsoft's attention went to EDiscovery, right? They completely refactored EDiscovery, okay? Same thing's happening in the cloud. A lot of attention being given to EDiscovery because when you think about compliance, you're thinking about the FBI coming into your offices, right? You're thinking about okay, here. Right? Okay, here's a workstation, do your searches, right? That's what we think about initially when we think about compliance. We don't think about, prevention and risk management. We think about reaction to the threat that we've kept information too long right? So discovery has gotten a lot of attention. So the discovery mechanism is really designed around this collect and preserve idea, right? Search for the items and preserve them, or search for the items and deliver them to the authorities, okay? It needs to be a lot richer than that, right? Because there are better models for doing EDiscovery. But this one is the one that's predominant, and this is the one that we have available in Exchange as well as in SharePoint. So in Exchange, basically you have a special console for doing the search. You move them into a special mailbox that has rules associated with it. You've got support for journaling, right, that gets captured as well, right? And then the whole bundle you give to whoever's making the request, okay? Legal holds is a little bit different. You've got legacy litigation holds, which were there in Exchange 2010. And now in 2013, you've got the additional thing of InPlace holds. They are different. Litigation Holds basically preserves everything, okay? Whereas with InPlace Holds, you've got a few additional features. The ability to associate the hold with a query, right? Or keyword query, keyword search, okay? And then the ability to say, all right, let's hold the information for a specific length of time. There's another misuse of terminology called a retention hold, right? Which is totally different, okay? It's still there, but a retention hold, the idea was, let's say you've got some disposition rules that have been set for a mailbox, okay? And the user whose mailbox that is goes on vacation, okay? You want to basically suspend the operation of the disposition rules that would otherwise apply to that mailbox until they come back. That's a retention hold. You're holding the retention, but that's not a legal hold. That's not either of these. That's not a litigation hold. That's not an in-place hold. It's a different idea entirely. So just to keep that in mind. All right. So now, where are we in terms of what are we getting with this new cloud-based SharePoint, right, offering, okay? You know, are we introducing new capabilities that, you know, are going to take advantage of this new platform? Short answer, no, right? Can't teach an old dog new tricks. If it wasn't there in SharePoint Online, SharePoint On-Prem, it isn't there in SharePoint Online either, okay? It's not going to fill the gaps that are already there in SharePoint Server, okay? It's not going to be a magic bullet. Okay? Even though it comes with the benefits that the cloud brings, right? It's going to be more limiting for any third-party vendors that have already filled those gaps in the SharePoint Server environment. It's a bigger burden, costs a lot more to develop, and there are limitations in the client object model that really impose severe constraints on what third parties are able to do today. Now, I happen to know that there are third parties that are working closely with Microsoft to resolve these gaps, okay? But to be honest, they're not high on, not the highest on the priority list in terms of what will be addressed first, right? I have no doubt that they will be resolved, right? For example, a good example is term store management through the client object model, right? That has been expanded greatly in response to pressure from third parties that needed to be able to get access to certain things like adding properties to terms and things like that, okay? That wasn't there in the client object model to begin with, right? It's coming through the interaction with third-party vendors. And the same thing's happening here in the CLM space. I know that Collabware is working closely with Microsoft. I know that Concept Searching has been working closely with Microsoft. I know that Knowledge Lake is working closely with Microsoft. So they will appear but as soon as they bubble up to the level of importance that, you know, makes them viable. And because you have no custom service applications available and you have the tenancy model, those additional constraints are also there. All right. Let's see. I think I went a little too fast. Okay. So, what does Office 365 provide in terms of CLM tools, right? We have IRM. IRM works much more cleanly and is easier to configure in the cloud than it was on-prem, right? Information rights management is part of client lifecycle management because you do want to control who has access to what they can do with the content when they see it, you know, permission-driven printing access and things like that, yes? Some of them are, yes, they are. I mean, it depends on what you see in terms of your admin console. Definitely depends on the license that you purchased, right? Is that good? Yes. So, I mean, you do, but these are available in the platform. You have information rights management. It's easier to configure because it's being controlled from the cloud. It's being controlled from a central place. You don't have to worry too much about, you know, how to set up the, you know, the rights management server and all those types of things that were very difficult to configure on-prem, right? That's all taken care of for you. It's sort of a security extension. Data loss prevention, you know, the ability to control when documents are deleted based on what their content is, right? So you have emails that have certain phrases in them. There is a built-in capability in Exchange Online that can look at that email, recognize the tag, and prevent the email from being deleted inadvertently, which goes directly to the compliance idea, right? We don't want anyone deleting emails that have certain controlled phrases in them. Not so much for documents, though, right? Much harder technically to manage with documents than it is in Exchange. So it's an Exchange-only thing. EDiscovery and Legal Hold, you have retention management, in-place record locking. You have this new idea of the site closure policy that I referred to before, is that you can define a detailed policy that controls what happens when the site is closed. So site as case that contains a lot of information in it. You can define a policy that takes care of bundling up all that information and deleting it at a certain time, right? Or not deleting it. There are certain rules that go along with that. And then you do have audit logging and auditing support. For EDiscovery in SharePoint, it's still a collect and preserve model, but it follows this case metaphor independently of sites. So you create a new thing called an EDiscovery case, right? That EDiscovery case contains one or more EDiscovery sets, and therefore within the EDiscovery set you can attach a query so that you can reuse that query and apply it to what's contained in that set. There are limitations on what content sources can be associated with the set. You can include Exchange mailboxes, and this is that unified EDiscovery that I was mentioning at the beginning, right? So within SharePoint, from within SharePoint, you can set up a query and rules that will include an Exchange store, right, in its search so that you can pull in emails as well as documents. However, you have to add those mailboxes one at a time, okay? So it's, again, collect and preserve is influencing this implementation because the assumption is that you're only doing this in response to the FBI asking you for the specific history of emails for a specific set of users, okay? And it's all designed that way, right? When in fact we need a much broader definition of it. The other constraint here with online is that you can't search areas that have not been indexed by the search engine. So you can't define a content source which lives outside of SharePoint. You have to either do it for Exchange or sites that are inside of SharePoint. Whereas, on-prem, you have much more flexibility in defining the EDiscovery rules, okay? And you cannot include file shares at all, right? So these are pretty serious limitations for EDiscovery online, right? I don't know if this is going to be lifted, right, through some mechanism that might be able to call back and search a file share, not sure. And this search index requirement is a pretty big one, okay, right? So, and there's some sort of natural questions that come into the mind, right? Well, I've indexed it, I've defined a query, but what if something happens to the index between the time that I define the query and I actually do the discovery? When does the discovery actually happen, right? It happens when you save the EDiscovery set, right? There's a little checkbox when you create an EDiscovery set. When we get into holds, it will become more obvious. So hold is implied when the discovery set is saved, right? Which means there's a binding between this notion of discovery and hold, right? You check this little box that says, should I include this as part of a legal hold? And then when you save the set with that checkbox check, it kicks off a timer job that looks at the query, runs the query. The query has to have, it's only applying to indexed items. So there's this sort of fragile relationship that exists between the EDiscovery set, the query, and the process for executing the query, which depends on the search having indexed that content source, right? There's a lot of areas for it to go wrong, right? In terms of what you intend for it to do. It's not as intuitive as it sounds, okay? All right? So there's, but if you're just doing collect and preserve, it's probably okay, right? For now. Surprisingly, or not surprisingly, there's no case law. Right? I do have a JD, right? So I'm thinking from the perspective of, it hasn't been tested, right? It's too new, right? You can bet that it's going to happen, but we don't have any evidence to support it one way or the other. So hopefully, this model will change before it gets to that point, okay? Because there's just, I don't think there's enough actual usage of these features yet. This resistance to the cloud is probably serving us in some perverted way, right? Because we're not stressing these architectures. We need to stress these architectures. Okay. Legal holds for sites works differently, right? Legal holds for sites uses this idea of a hidden preservation library. So the idea, and it's done, for efficiency as well. So the idea is that when you want to do legal hold on a site, and people are using sites as sort of a case management system, you really only interested in preserving items that are being changed, right? So when the item is changed, okay, and the site is on hold, you have to preserve the item that was there before the change happened. So you move it into this hidden preservation library that nobody sees. You can get access to it if you have the appropriate permissions, obviously. But for most users, they can just go in and change the item. They don't really care because the snapshot is being preserved and the legal hold is being satisfied, right? Okay? But there are limitations to this as well. It only tracks versions. It only keeps track of the last version, right? If you want to keep track of all versions, someone has to go into each site within that site or each list or library within that site and turn on versioning so that the legal hold will apply to all versions and all versions will be preserved. It's not on by default because it's too costly from a performance perspective, right? But again, the preservation is only happening when the item is changed. So there's some logic in there to check when it was last changed and whether it was changed on hold or not to determine whether the preservation copy is made. Retention management, similar to the on-prem approach, basically using information management policy with retention rules and stages, okay? You have to configure it, and it's not as extensible as what you get on-prem, right? Obviously, when I'm talking about extensibility, as a developer, there are all kinds of hooks that you can put into the information policy infrastructure inside of SharePoint On-Prem that allow you to extend, how retention is managed. You can put custom expiration formulas to try to, create some semblance of event-based retention management. You can do a lot of things from a developer's perspective on-prem that you cannot do in the cloud, okay? In-place record locking, right? I keep coming up with different ways to describe what is being called in-place records management. It's really, record declaration, record locking, similar, but you have to do a manual declaration from the ribbon. And I mentioned before, it permanently affects the item. And the hook that is available in the on-prem version isn't available in the cloud. There's some site properties that you can set that points to a custom DLL. Obviously, you can't do that in the cloud. The site closure policy idea, you've got some options when you're defining a site policy. And these are basically them. Don't close the site or delete it automatically. Okay, you can say, okay, I'm going to handle the site closure and I'm going to handle the deletion myself. Or you can tell it to automatically delete the site, right, given certain conditions. You can say close and delete the site. So there's this useful distinction between closing a site and deleting it. So you can close the site, which basically makes it read-only, but you can delay the deletion of the site for a certain period of time, okay? Or you can then delegate the deletion and closure of the site to a separate workflow. So it's pretty complete in terms of what you can do at site closure, how to close sites, right, which is getting more in the direction of some of the things that you would want to see, more broadly for CLM and other areas. Whatever team put together the site closure stuff did a pretty good job, I think, of covering those cases. This is my view of the ideal CLM model for the cloud. Okay? There is no ideal, right? We're in new territory. It's like, the Wild West in terms of what we come up with for defining what CLM looks like and needs to look like in the cloud. But it's back to that same problem. We have not stressed this architecture, right? Most companies are still getting their heads around how do we organize the information in preparation for moving it into an environment like this, right? So this is, on you, right? Come up with models, because if you don't come up with them now, they're not going to percolate up to the top of the stack for Microsoft to implement, okay? You got to talk to your vendors. You got to talk to Microsoft. You got to say, look, we need this, we need this, we need this, because these are the models that we need to implement, okay? If you look at some of the vendor offerings, like Collabware, they did not model their records management strategy, implementation strategy on DoD 5015. They modeled it on MOREC, okay, which is more service-based, right? Right, which, is kind of the gold standard for thinking about content lifecycle management, right? Microsoft is moving toward that, but they've baked in capabilities that were driven by 5015, right? Which is more reactive, sort of my take on where we are with the technology and where we're going, right? I think these vendors who are filling these gaps are the ones that are setting the bar for where Microsoft needs to go with the services that they provide. So I think there's a limited market window for these vendors to provide this support, because gradually, because of the way that the cloud economies of scale work and that it is going to become an information utility, these capabilities will find their way into the mainstream product, but not at the rate that we need them to. So, key considerations, I think I've got minus 5 minutes, right? You really need to understand user behavior in defining these kinds of support. You have to do a complete information architecture to really get at how you need to structure the information before you think about migrating it into the cloud. I hope I've given you some insight into what's going to be there and what isn't going to be there, just to sort of tickle the brain a little bit. This is a study that was done by a consulting firm, Conturo. But if you look at, these are record types and percentage of plans for email, right? Most of the record types are there in this general 5-year plan. When I started consulting with government agencies, there was just one category, and it was permanent, right? Just keep it all, okay? But in reality, it's not happening. People are really thinking about how email is going to be used. And this general model, I think, is also descriptive of what's going on with documents. People, when they're thinking about how long to keep things, 5-year plan is kind of what keeps coming up, right? And then beyond that, less, because there are certain things that are dictated by retention policies that are being used or applied in highly regulated companies. But you got to get a handle on what that looks like for your organization, right? Where is most of the juice that you're going to be able to derive benefit from? Some additional considerations, and this will be in the slide deck that you can download. Should you be keeping business records in email, right, as attachments, right? And if so, how do you do that? How do you deal with event-based retention? Okay, it's kind of the elephant in the room. There are permanent records, and you can see that the recommendation here is just classify them, tag them, and send them into SharePoint, where you have much more robust rule management. Okay, and a big question for email is, should you allow personal storage at all? Okay, and if you do, what are the rules? If you don't, how do you migrate out of them? Right? There's a big issue here. And this is in that category of bad habits that have come from inadequate technology. For documents, workflow, and business process, custom features that may be that your documents may be dependent on. Does classification change within stages? This is this notion of, once I declare it as a record, is it always a record? Okay. Is there some stage in its life where it maybe isn't a record anymore, right? Or is there a stage in its life where it has to become more of a record, meaning it's more constrained? Those are issues that have to be dealt with. This whole notion of collaboration, if multiple authors are contributing content, then who's the custodian of the record? These are issues that are not obvious. Are you dealing with compound shared metadata? Okay. I'm going to skip through, because these are all kind of there. These are sort of things that are there to be part of your consideration that I've just added to the slide deck. And that takes us to the end. Thank you very much for attending.